Well, good evening, everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to be here with you, and I'm particularly grateful to the University of Idaho, and in particular the Martin Institute, for this chance to speak and to get to have some time. I've now been here for 3 days. I got one more to go tomorrow, and I have been so impressed by the students here at this university and their engagement and their interest and their passion and their commitment to seeing a world in which they make a difference. That is reassuring to an old guy like me. As you heard, and thank you for that introduction, I've spent a significant portion of my professional life as a U.S. diplomat working on European issues and European security affairs, both in Washington and overseas. And I wanted to take this opportunity to reflect together with you on the state of the U.S. relationship with Europe, particularly at this moment, which is a moment of considerable transition. Now, as you may have seen in the advertisements, the title of my remarks was, quote, U.S.-European Relations, Partnership, Power, and Policy in a Changing World. And beyond the alliteration of that last little bit, I chose that title rather deliberately because I think it reflects the key issues we need to be thinking about as we think about U.S. and Europe, and that is partnership, policy dynamics, or power dynamics, and policy at a time of both change and, in some respects, transition. So the U.S. relationship with Europe, or the European relationship with the United States, is often discussed and thought about as if it were a fixed inheritance, something automatic, something inevitable. But in reality, that is not the case. It is a living partnership that has required sustained effort, political will, strategic judgment across generations. Now, I believe, and I'm going to assert in these remarks, that it is a partnership that has delivered significant benefits for the American people. It's also delivered significant benefits for our European partners. In these remarks, before we get to questions, I'm going to try to address three broad questions. The first one, what has the U.S.-European partnership achieved, and how has it advanced the interests of the United States? The second one, where do we find ourselves today in a period marked by geopolitical competition and internal strain? And third, why, despite real differences and disagreements, the United States and Europe, do they still need each other? And I believe they do. Why do we still need each other? And how do we benefit from this relationship? So let me start with what this partnership has achieved and how we got here. Point one. In the aftermath of the Second World War, Europe lay devastated, economically, politically, socially. The United States emerged at the same time from this war with unparalleled power, but also with a choice. American leaders could have chosen to withdraw, relying on geography, military strength to insulate the United States from future turmoil. They didn't make that choice. They chose instead engagement, continued engagement, robust engagement with Europe. And that choice fundamentally shaped the post-war world. Through the Marshall Plan, the United States helped rebuild Europe's economies, stabilized democratic governments, prevented the conditions that had fueled conflict in the past, or played a significant role in preventing those conditions. Through NATO, the United States made a binding commitment to European security, anchoring American power permanently in Europe and standing together with democratic partners against the Soviet threat to peace, stability, and democracy. Now, I want to make one point. This was not charity. This was strategic foresight. A stable, prosperous Europe served American interests directly by reducing the likelihood of war, creating reliable economic partners, markets for our goods and services, strengthening a community of democratic states capable of resisting authoritarian and, at that time, communist pressure led by the Soviet Union. And let me pause on this moment for a second, because while this all seems to make sense, I think, with 2020 hindsight, it was not at all clear at the time these decisions were made that this outcome was inevitable. It may feel that way to us now, but let me tell you, it was not. And in the late 1940s, as these decisions were being made, there were serious debates in Washington about whether the United States could or should shoulder the long-term costs of European recovery and defense. Americans were war-weary. There was a strong pressure to turn inward. But what ultimately carried the day was a recognition. The recognition was that the United States could pay up front through investment, diplomacy, alliance management, alliance creation, or pay later, responding to instability, crisis, and potentially renewed conflict. There was a wager made on this transatlantic partnership that prevention was cheaper than intervention. I will tell you, from my perspective, that wager proved correct. Europe became not only secure, but capable of governing itself democratically, capable of contributing, at times not sufficiently, but contributing to a collective defense, capable of partnering with the United States to advance and achieve shared interests globally. Now, throughout the Cold War, the transatlantic partnership delivered results that in historical terms were extraordinary. Europe, in contrast to the last several hundred years, was no longer an epicenter of global conflict. The Soviet Union, our rival, our antagonist, our focus of concern, was contained and ultimately collapsed. And again, it feels inevitable now, but it wasn't inevitable at the time. It collapsed without a great power war or conflict. Democratic institutions took root and flourished across Western Europe. This is the outcome of those choices. Now, there are also some who fail to recognize a key facet of this period. The alliance was never without tension. There were disputes over many things, over nuclear weapons, over Vietnam, over trade, over relations with Moscow, over how to handle Moscow. But I would say those disputes were generally managed within a framework of shared commitment and mutual restraint. Allies argued sometimes fiercely, but they didn't abandon each other and they remained allies. Healthy alliances are not defined by the absence of disagreement. I defy you to name a single bilateral or multilateral arrangement in which there are not disagreements. But healthy alliances are defined by the presence of mechanisms to manage disagreement without calling the relationship itself into question. Now, when the Cold War ended, many assumed that this alliance, especially the NATO piece of it, had outlived its purpose. Instead, it adapted. NATO enlarged to include new democracies in Central and Eastern Europe, supporting the aspirations of people who had been subject to authoritarianism and communism to make their own choices about their security and their democracies and the nature of governments they would have. I'm proud as a U.S. diplomat to have been part of that process to help support the transition from communism to democracy and to choose for themselves, rather than have forced upon them through the Warsaw Pact, their own security arrangements. The United States and Europe worked together to stabilize the Balkans after violent conflict, and I can talk a lot about that, having had the opportunity again as a U.S. diplomat, a junior one, and later on a senior one, to work on these issues. We talk about it a lot, but can I restate something significant? In the history of the NATO alliance, the central commitment, Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which established the NATO alliance, that an attack on one is an attack on all, and allies will respond as an alliance to an attack on any of us. The one time in the history of the alliance that that provision was invoked through a decision by the North Atlantic Council that must be unanimous, and was on the 12th of September 2001, one day after the attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, after 9/11. So I will freely acknowledge some of the efforts together were controversial, some were imperfect, but they did reflect generally a shared understanding. And they reflected, I think, a reality. And that reality is, from my perspective, American power is most effective when it is exercised in partnership with Europe. Generally, our problems around the world are things that we have been more successful in addressing when we do so with our European partners. So that history and that background, and those achievements that I've just talked about, point one, and now move to point two. That history brings us to the present and this second point. Where are we today? Today, the transatlantic relationship faces a markedly different strategic environment. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine has shattered assumptions about European security and about the post-war order, and reminded us that territorial conquest is absolutely not a relic of the past. We're confronting something we didn't envision even 25 years ago, a growing economic and technical reach by China, presenting challenges that I think no single country can manage alone. We're seeing democratic societies under pressure from polarization, misinformation, declining trust in institutions, the very institutions that delivered some of these results I've been talking about. And although it never was, Europe now is most decidedly not monolithic. There are very different threat perceptions and very different areas of focus amongst our European partners and allies, between East and West, North and South. For countries on NATO's eastern flank, Russia is not an abstract concern, it is a lived reality. For Southern Europe, instability in North Africa and migration seem to be looming much larger as threats to their security and prosperity. For Northern Europe, the focus is, I think, the Arctic, energy security, technological competition. That's what's dominating their strategic thinking. Let me share just one vignette that brings some of this into focus. I remember, it was a number of years ago, in fact, it was 2005, so it was a while ago. I took up a new position as the Deputy Director of the Office for European Security at the State Department. This is the office that sends our instructions on a daily basis to our mission to NATO and our mission to the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, and does our arms control portfolio with Europe. And so I was basically a senior US official doing NATO for a living at that time. And I was invited, I was in Berlin. There was a meeting of all of the defense ministers, or in our case, the Secretary of Defense of NATO allies, hosted by the Germans, because on that occasion, in 2005, we were celebrating the 50th anniversary of Germany's accession into NATO. While NATO was created earlier, there were some reasons why Germany didn't join right away in its post-war reconsolidation, but the Germans acceded to NATO in 1955, so in 2005, there was a big 50th anniversary. So we had a day of formal meetings, and I was there as the senior State Department guy on the Donald Rumsfeld delegation having this meeting. And at the end of the meeting, as is always the case in these diplomatic events, don't always believe what you see in the Mission Impossible movies, but there was a big fancy reception in a ballroom with chandeliers and glasses of champagne being handed around, and I always got my Diet Coke for me. And I look up and I see my Latvian, Lithuanian, and Estonian counterparts marching towards me with a singular focus. And I'm trying to sip my soda and chat with a colleague, and they get in my face. It's a polite getting in my face, and if you know Northern Europeans, they still respect your personal space. But they are there, and they are ready to talk. And it's clearly that they are coordinated in this. And they say to me that they've been looking for me, they'd hoped to find me after the meeting, and I'd snuck away. And they had an issue they needed to discuss with me that was of, quote, exceptional concern. And the thing they laid out, they said, look, because they had just joined, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were part of a second round of NATO enlargement, and they had just joined the alliance the previous year, 2004, with some other allies as well. Their concern was this, that while NATO planners, the military planning staff, had a wide, deep set of plans for the defense of NATO allies in the event of an attack. Deep volumes of plans for Germany, for example, and the threat of the Soviet Union or the Russians now coming through the Fulda Gap and across the plains of Germany. For Turkey and NATO's southern flank, for much of Allied territory, there were no formal plans for NATO to defend Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia in the event of Russian aggression. Even though they bordered Russia, and they had a history as recent as 1940 of being annexed into the Soviet Union over their objections. And they wanted the United States to demand the same level of planning for the defense of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia that we had for many other allies. So this was my reception. Fun times. I didn't have a good answer for them. At that point, US policy was we would support military planning for Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and the other new allies for whom we didn't have defense plans, not all, but some. But some of our allies, including some of the largest allies, were in strong disagreement with this. Because their argument was the Russians would never invade Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia again. Now we're in a different era. We're working to build a relationship with Russia and NATO. And if we start doing these plans, word will get out and the Russians will know about it and they will see this as a threatening move and an escalation, and it will destroy all the efforts we're trying to do to build a better relationship with Russia. So we should not and cannot develop defense plans for Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Plus the idea of Russia taking any aggressive actions against them is preposterous. I'm almost quoting a colleague from a nation that I will not name. You can guess. So I am proud that I had left, I never got this done during my time, but a few years later while I was doing other things for the Department of State, under the presidency of President George W. Bush, they got to him at some point. It didn't get very successful with me, and I didn't have the ability to move policy. The president did. And I think it was the Latvian, Lithuanian, Estonian prime ministers that got to him. But he agreed that this needed to happen, and he led an effort within the alliance, and lo and behold, we got defense plans, and it is a good thing we do. It's a good thing we have them now, that's for sure. But I tell that story to underscore the point of some of the divisions, I mean, this is a while ago, but that are still reflected in the alliance. So differences we see in assessing threats, differences we see in the best policy choices to manage threats. Now, turning back to this question of where are we right now? In this context, I think recent strains in the U.S.-European relationship have also taken on heightened importance. Public disputes at this moment in time over trade, defense spending, and most recently, Greenland, and it's to where does Greenland's sovereignty lie, have raised real questions in European capitals about American predictability and reliability and commitment to this longer-term project I've been talking about. Now, let me reiterate, disagreement among allies is not new, nor is it inherently dangerous. We know how to manage disagreement with allies, but what matters is how those disagreements are handled and managed. And from my perspective, the Greenland episode, the recent one, highlighted concerns from European partners and colleagues about process, about predictability, and about U.S. respect for European sovereignty. Predictability and respect for positions of an ally is not rigidity and it is not weakness. It can be a strategic asset. And particularly in my time working on NATO affairs, allies generally are better partners with us and they are more inclined to do the things we want to do and support us in that when they are able to anticipate our asks and anticipate our behaviors so that they can plan, deter adversaries, and oftentimes make difficult political decisions at home or prepare for difficult political decisions at home. Likewise, economic leverage, sanctions, tariffs, other sorts of things, can be powerful tools, particularly when used against adversaries. And we've generally used the sanctions tool against adversaries. Used against allies, it can sometimes create real strategic risk and potential costs. So this brings me to question number 3. Why do we still need each other? Why do we still need each other? What's in it for us? How do we benefit from this relationship? And in some ways, I think this is probably the most important question of this discussion we're having right now, or it's still a one-sided discussion, but I promise it will become a two-sided discussion. My answers are not going to be nostalgia. They're not going to be diplomatic habit. They're grounded in hard-headed assessments of U.S. interests and strategy. First, we actually do still need each other for security. Some of you may laugh and think the United States can take care of itself. And we often can. But the bottom line is a secure Europe remains an American policy interest and priority. Preventing conflict in Europe, just as people calculated in the 1940s and early 50s, is far less costly than fighting wars there. We sometimes forget that the previous generations of Americans didn't have the luxury of avoiding European wars. And the United States spent substantial blood and treasure establishing and maintaining peace there not so long ago. During my grandfather's lifetime, he got to serve in the U.S. Navy during the Second World War. For those who argue that conflict in Europe should no longer be a U.S. concern, I would counter with maybe one of the same exhibits you might bring up, which is the situation in Ukraine, where the very real question right now of whether Russia can seize territory and unilaterally change borders and makes decisions for the future of a separate sovereign state is on the table right now. I think NATO remains the most successful defensive alliance in history because it combines American military capabilities and American political will with European commitment, legitimacy, and geography. It is true, forward deployed US forces in Europe are a cost to us, but they deter aggression, reduce miscalculation, and reassure allies, and we're ultimately probably going to have to deploy anyway if we aren't there when they're needed. In a world where Russia has demonstrated its absolute readiness, willingness to use force, and has done so, deterrence is not theoretical, it's operational. Let me tell another story. When I was assigned to the National Security Council during the early years of the Obama administration, I was tasked to lead an interagency process to respond directly to Polish requests for a US military presence in Poland. The Poles were already spooked, this is 2009, of Russia territorial claims on Poland and Russian aggression against Poland, and they wanted US soldiers there because they felt like even having a few US soldiers would be an extreme deterrent against Russian aggression. This was tricky because a few years earlier, in 1997, at a moment of greater cooperation between Russia and NATO, but at a time where Russia was undergoing a lot of transition itself, and that Russians now would tell you is probably their moment of greatest weakness, we had concluded this thing called the NATO-Russia Founding Act, a 1997 agreement that sought to establish a less conflictual NATO relationship with Russia as it was making this transition from communism. And as an element of the NATO-Russia Founding Act, NATO allies, not just the United States, all of us, had committed not to deploy either nuclear weapons or, quote, permanently station substantial combat forces, unquote, in new member states such as Poland. Now, we left ourselves a huge amount of space. What is permanent? What is station? What is substantial? What is combat force? You can see how diplomats like to play with words here. But we had this commitment. But the context, just, a number of years later, 2009, and Poland's very justified assessment of the Russian threat was really, really different in 2009 than it was in 1997 when the NATO-Russian Founding Act was concluded. So I, as an NSC director, the director at the National Security Council, on behalf of the President and the White House, I led this interagency process to engage with the Department of Defense, Department of State, intelligence community, other parts of the US government enterprise. What could we do? What could we send that would scratch the itch for Poland of having a real, credible, significant US military presence in Poland, but that also was consistent with the commitments we made in the NATO-Russia Founding Act, because at that time, it was still policy to respect it, and legitimately so. We do not anymore, and that's not on us, because the Russians have violated it in every way possible. And so at this point, we do not have the same debates we had in 2009 about what would be permanent, what would be stationed, and what would be a substantial combat force in Poland. And we've got quite a lot there. But this was the camel's nose under the tent. This was the first one. And we ultimately found a way to bring in something meaningful. It was a Patriot battery, a Patriot missile battery. Now, I suspect many of you are familiar with Patriot missiles, but the capability is impressive. It can deter and intercept tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drones nowadays, and high-performance aircraft. And we deployed this to Poland in a manner that was consistent, we thought, with the NATO-Russia Founding Act, but that also was meaningful for us. And while the Poles absolutely appreciated and welcomed and felt safer because we had US soldiers with this Patriot battery there, this capacity also enhanced our security, because all those things I just mentioned, well, read them again, tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, we weren't so worried about drones in 2009 yet. We weren't that good. But yes, high-performance aircraft on its way from Russia to the United States would probably be going over some element of Poland or close enough to that battery that it could intercept and play a role. So this was a win-win, and win-wins exist consistently in our relationship with Europe. So the Russians complained strongly, which let us know they knew we were there, which let us know this did exactly what we wanted it to do. We enhanced security of a key ally at a moment of real concern and tension. We enhanced our own security as well. So this is one of the first things I want to talk about of why we still need each other. Our security is enhanced as we enhance European security, as we support European security. I do not disagree that Europeans can play a more active role in their own security. And I welcome efforts made by a number of administrations, absolutely including the current administration, to see allies putting a greater share of their gross domestic product towards their security. But we have a role to play too, and we are harming ourselves when we do not play that role. The second reason why I think we still need each other. We need each other for global power and influence. This is more esoteric, but it is very, very real. The United States and Europe together have shaped global rules and norms on a number of items, on trade, on technology, on finance, on development, sometimes, not always, on climate. When we align, when we're together, the standards we establish almost inevitably become the global standard. It is rare to see a global standard on these types of issues emerging from an alternative source if the United States and Europe are aligned. That is powerful. That is meaningful. That is manifestly in our interest. Likewise, when we're divided on these things, we create space exactly for others, particularly the Chinese nowadays, to come in and try to shape the international system in ways that may not at all align with our interests or values. We're seeing, this, just think about the need for norm setting in areas like technology governance, how to handle AI, supply chains, industrial policy. No single country, not even the United States at this moment in history, can set these rules on our own. We have to reach global consensus. But when you have a US-European agreement, it's pretty hard for that not to become the norm. So that's another area where we still benefit collectively from our partnership. Third, I think we still need each other for values. And this is understood not as uniformity, but as a shared commitment. These ideas of democratic governance, respect for the rule of law, respect for sovereignty, they're not abstract at this moment in time, very clearly. And they are absolutely sources of legitimacy and influence, and they reflect universal truths that were the absolute basis for the establishment of our country. So in a world where authoritarian models are being actively promoted by some, I think the transatlantic partnership is the strongest demonstration that democracy, true democracy, can deliver security and prosperity and promote values like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all of us. We have achieved that together frequently, working with our European partners. And finally, partnership multiplies power. Almost every major challenge we face, transnational organized crime, terrorism, global health issues, pandemics, migration, technological competition, climate change, crosses borders. Very few of these issues can be addressed effectively by any state alone, including the United States. Partnership need not be a constraint on American power, and in fact, it is frequently a multiplier. Let me give you one more example, more from the past. I'll have some more contemporary examples probably in the Q&A. But right after 9/11, we figured out that some of the ways that the terrorists who conducted the 9/11 attacks had done so because of access to the global banking system, that financiers, primarily in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, were able to provide significant sums of money to pay for the training and equipping and capabilities of the terrorists who carried out those devastating attacks here in the United States. We also learned that these groups were organized and they were smart. They knew how to move money around in ways we couldn't trace. They knew how to hide their money in places we wouldn't know, and they knew how to get access to it to enable them to carry out additional attacks. So they quickly moved assets from where they were to new places in banking systems that were not cooperating with the United States, including some European countries. I'm sure many of you have grown up hearing about the safety and security and anonymity of Swiss banks and how people can put stuff in Swiss banks and nobody knows who has it or why it's there. And the Swiss bankers will never divulge anything about their account holders. And by the way, that was, keyword here was, largely true. But after 9/11, at that point I was running the office at the State Department that was responsible for relations with Germany and Austria and Switzerland. and Liechtenstein, by the way, who also has weird banking secrecy rules, and we got the same outcomes with them. We went to the Swiss early on. And as part of this engagement, and we said, we must have new agreements with you now. This is urgent, so that we can block money transfers and you can seize and hold accounts and freeze assets that are associated with terrorist networks. We've got to get this together. And I was expecting a big fight from the Swiss. And the Swiss bankers wanted a big fight. They wouldn't say it, because nobody wanted to say, we don't want to help you on terrorism. But the Swiss bankers wanted to talk about all the ways in which they were unique and special. And this was complex, this was complicated, and the Swiss government said, we agree. It took longer than we hoped, because negotiating with the Swiss on complex things like how do you violate your banking secrecy laws, not violate, but amend them to allow a provision of information for legitimate law enforcement purposes in furtherance of combating terrorism. But this was done not in years or even, it was done in months, but only a couple. It was more weeks. And the result, I think you know, denying an enormous enabling platform for terrorists to finance activities and whatever else. Greater security for Europe, greater security for the United States. But getting that ask out of the Swiss, which we got, required some prior goodwill, some prior coordination, some prior understanding where we were coming from. So let me conclude my formal remarks with this thought. That was issue number 3. Why do we still need each other? The U.S.-European relationship has delivered, I believe, substantial benefits to the United States over the past, since the end of the Second World War. It is not guaranteed, as I said. We look at it as if it is inevitable, but it is not. It has to be tended. Diplomacy is largely tending the garden. And just when you think you're done tending the garden is when they've begun to accept that you take them seriously. Some ways, so in some ways it's like human relations, right? It has to be tended, it has to be renewed, it has to be adapted to changing circumstances. We have a good track record in doing all those things. In the immediate post-war era, during the Cold War, in the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall. But we are again at an inflection point. We are at a moment of transition in the U.S.-European relation. And the choices we make right now about partnership, predictability, consultation, mutual respect, really determines the strength, not the durability, but certainly the strength of the relationship, and whether the relationship will continue to robustly serve American interests in a changing world. So as someone who spent a lot of years working with European allies in a lot of different ways, I remain convinced that the strong partnership is important, and that our relationship with Europe has been, can be, and should be one of our best, greatest strategic advantages. Thank you. And I look forward to your questions and the discussion we're going to have now. And I think we've got 25 minutes-ish. So.
We don't have a microphone. I think we are small enough groups and can get up and be robust and ask your questions.
Yep.
So
yeah, if you'd like to if you would like to either comment or question, please do raise your hand, and I will do my best to recognize you. And we got our first taker. Someone is brave. And if you don't mind, if you're a student, just tell me your name and what you're studying, because I'm always interested in that.
First, thank you very much for coming. My name is Ethan Reed. I am studying history, Chinese, and I'm a cadet in Air Force ROTC.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you very much. My two questions really quick are, one, what do you think the advantages of a potentially federalized European Union would be? And two, what do you think the advantages that Europe could give us in a potential war against China would be, if any?
Yeah. So I'll start with the first one, and then I'll go to the second one. Federalized European Union. It's the same advantages in some ways that our nation confronted when we made the transition from Articles of Confederation to our Constitution. There is real power and strength in a more organized executive branch, in shared responsibilities in certain ways while still allowing states certain rights. That is the vision of some in Europe. I am skeptical about a federalized European Union because they're doing this in a very different era and time. And the European consolidation project is coming from a very different place than our process of forming ourselves as a nation. Because what you have are a series of nation states that were established as sovereign states, no question about it, that over a number of years, kind of my entire lifetime almost, and a little more, have voluntarily ceded sovereignty little by little in specific functional areas. It adds up to something big, but it's a series of iterative decisions over time. And they've done it in the places that have made the most sense and that are easiest to do and that don't directly affect national security, although some would quibble with that last point. So you began with the economics and trade, and now that part of EU policy and decision making is firmly in Brussels. Germany doesn't get to decide anymore if it's going to put tariffs on US products. Brussels does. Germany has a voice, a big voice, in whether or not Brussels makes that decision, but Germany doesn't get to decide that anymore. And if you would have told Germany that 45 years ago they were going to voluntarily cede that authority, they would have laughed at you. But it didn't happen all at once, it happened over time. That part is reasonably, I don't know if I want to call it federalized, but centralized. But it's harder on law enforcement and kind of the stuff, the DHF's and our system suite of stuff. There's some, but not a lot. No political leader wants to have a police force in every country responding to some Eurocrat in Brussels. And it just simply hasn't happened on foreign policy and national security. There's no such, there's no such EU-wide intel service. There is an intel service in the EU, and all it does is collect up stuff from the individual member states and then waters it down so it can be shared in a way that's kind of unhelpful and then circulated. It doesn't do anything, it has no operational capacity. And the member states don't want it to, because no prime minister or minister of defense wants to lose control over that. Same thing with foreign policy. You occasionally have coordinated EU positions, but it's coordinated EU positions coming directly from the member states, who then get together and they come up with a statement that's kind of a watered down thing by committee, and then the countries go and do what they want in foreign policy anyway. This is in direct, I don't mean this as a criticism, because I can understand why the foreign minister of Holland doesn't want to have to be subject to something he disagreed with, but that got adopted because the Spaniards wanted it, for example. This is so very different from the economics, if you get my point. So, if it were to happen, to some extent for us, that would likely be a better partner, because we wouldn't have to spend so much time dealing with so many different foreign ministers and prime ministers and presidents and ministers of defense and all the rest. We would finally have the complete answer to that age-old question from Henry Kissinger: if I want to call Europe, whom do I call? And the answer is a lot of people, and that's what we do. When I was at the White House with President Obama, it took some time to convince him that we want this thing out of Europe. Now you're going to call Sarkozy, and you're going to call Merkel, and you're going to call the British counterpart, and you're going to call, I need you to do 7 calls, not 1. And he'd look at me like, I want to do 1 call. I actually want to do no calls. Can you guys achieve this without me? That would be even better. But that's just not the way it works, and it won't for a while. War against China. Well, I'm a diplomat. So what I'm going to say is our softer power institutions in the Department of Defense need to be really, really, really good at China so that we avoid this scenario, because I think a war against China is devastating for China and devastating for the United States. And it's something just at the most strategic level we have to avoid. There's no reason for conflict right now. That could change, if they actually do take aggressive actions against Taiwan and some other things. But I think part of what we have to be doing as a national security apparatus is everything possible to build a more productive relationship with China. It means China changing some of how it's approaching things as well, because thus far the Chinese have great power kind of capabilities in certain areas, particularly on the economics and trade, but are not always showing the great power level of responsibility we need them to. And that, again, requires engagement. It requires conversations. It requires mutual respect. It requires finding win-wins, building reservoirs of trust, reservoirs of shared interest, which is not the easiest ask with China, but that's, from my perspective, where we've got to be focusing right now. All right, I think I answered that one. Question right there.
My name is Riley, and I study IS, and I was just wondering, how do you think that the conflict within NATO and Turkey, with their current tenuous relationship with Russia, will move NATO?
So, Turkey and NATO is both an interesting and existential question. But Turkey both benefits an awful lot from its status as a full member of NATO, and the alliance also benefits an awful lot from having Turkey as a full member of the alliance. Turkey has always had its own unique perspective on Russia. It sees Russia as a threat, but it also sees Russia as a neighbor, and it gets to live in that neighborhood in ways we don't. Turkey has existential interests on the Black Sea. So does Russia. Turkey has significant interests on what's going on in the Caucasus. So does Russia. I could go on and on. There are areas where for a lot of other allies, those are interesting issues off to the margins that are front and center if you live in Turkey. And if you live in Turkey, if you look around, it's a wonderful place to visit and be. It's not a great neighborhood. You look north, there's Russia. You look that way, there's Iran. You look down there, there's Libya, North Africa. You look that way. It's not a place where you can say life is good, we can let our guard down. So part of what Turkey benefits from is this Article 5 commitment that allies have a role to play in ensuring Turkey's security. And Turkey's in a place where when we want to project power and influence to stop conflict, we frequently need to be doing so from Turkey. So I think most allies can be frustrated with Turkish diplomats at NATO because they often come with their own unique set of requirements. They're very, very good. Some of the most capable and agile and able diplomats working in the NATO councils are your Turkish counterparts. If you want to negotiate a document, they come in and they know every chapter and verse of this thing in ways that kind of put you to shame. They're really, really good. And it's frustrating because you just want to get to the strategic point and get done and let's conclude, and they know. But I think most allies see that there's great interest in the alliance, in our Turkish ally and partner, and we've got to be responsive to their concerns about security. No one wants to unduly harm this relationship. And I don't think right now anybody's saying the Turks are so cozied up to the Russians that we can't trust them on these geopolitical things that we're working with them together. So I don't see a big rift in the alliance. I do see, as I talked about in my remarks, differing threat perceptions. But I'd say we've all learned to be, when our Turkish colleagues raise their hands and raise their voice and raise a threat conception, a threat perception, we generally want to take it seriously. There is one big exception to what I just said, and that was a U.S. choice, not an allied choice. And that was the partnership we formed with the Kurdish forces in northern Syria to prosecute the war against ISIS. That is, we're still going to be paying the price for a while, I think, in the bilateral relationship with Turkey. Because for almost any Turk, regardless of political party, from their perspective, this is just the United States building a relationship with an entity that they believe to be, with some cause, a terrorist organization that has killed tens of hundreds of Turks. So that's my take on that one. I'm going to go, I thought I saw somebody over there. I did see somebody over there. And then I'll come this way, I promise. I'm going to ask you to speak a little louder because I can't hear you.
I'm Bethany Vanover. I'm studying biotechnology, but I do have a general interest in studies. My question is sort of like two things at once. What would happen in the event of, say, what's going on in Greenland? If the U.S. becomes an aggressor to a fellow NATO state, what would happen after that, and how would we go about mending those relationships in the aftermath?
Sure. So, as a career diplomat who spent a lot of time on NATO issues, the prospect of the United States using military force against a fellow NATO ally is rather disconcerting. Because what would happen, it's hard to say. But certainly, many allies would call into question the nature of the alliance itself. Some allies, in this case, using this scenario, I mean, it is a. The president has now said he will not use force, and I think we should take him at his word, and that is welcome. But I think many allies would probably want to evoke Article 5, and then if you think about what that means, that parts of the alliance are saying one of us has been attacked, and so we all need to defend Greenland against the United States, a fellow ally. As the Danish Prime Minister was saying a couple of weeks ago, this is the end of the alliance. I'm not sure that's true because the things we do together at NATO are so deep and so broad and so central to security for all of us that parts of the NATO enterprise, I suspect, would still somehow go forward, but they would be deeply damaged. And the political elements of the alliance, because the alliance is this very straightforward, clear-eyed defense of one another, but it's also a forum. It's a place where we talk and deal with hard issues together, where we do a lot of things for our respective both militaries and national security apparati that would be damaged in ways that probably would not recover. So I think that's what led the president to make his comments at Davos now a couple weeks ago, that he would not seek to take Greenland by force because of how devastating that would be to something that, at least as I laid out in my remarks, is so, I believe, so fundamentally beneficial to American strategic interests and security, as well as acknowledging it's fundamentally beneficial to European strategic interests and security as well. I don't know that I have more to say on that. I saw hands this way. Yes, we'll go there.
Yeah, my name is Willow. I study international studies in Spanish. I wanted to, again, thank you for coming and giving this talk and also being here this week. It's really amazing. I'm wondering if you could provide any insights about what Europe might be thinking, the European Union, also just member states, about U.S. actions in Venezuela and in the Caribbean. Like, how is that viewed?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. It depends on who you're talking to, and depends on the country and their interests. Spain always takes a much stronger interest in what's going on in Latin America than any other part of the European Union. There's a little bit of unease. Because it feels, I think, it's hard for me to speak for the Europeans. What I have picked up on is some unease. This feels both unilateral and that peaceful alternatives to sending in U.S. special forces to remove a sitting head of state from their perspective, because many of them had recognized Maduro, not all, and some did not as well, but a head of state or an ostensible head of state from their home with their spouse and taking them to the Southern District of New York court system. What I've heard from European partners is a suggestion that perhaps more preparatory work could have been done and more alternative options to this type of an operation might have been explored. But I'm also not seeing strong criticism. And that is probably because for a lot of Europeans, Venezuela is both a headache, but it also isn't a strategic interest. If we'd done this in Libya, we'd have a different conversation with them. But when we did Libya, and we did it differently, of course, we did it together with Europe. And so we worked through together what we were going to do and how we were going to do it, and so it's very different. There is also some unease of the current administration's emphasis about, the position probably most easily summed up in the recent tweet from the Department of State with the map of the Western Hemisphere just saying, this is our hemisphere. Just as there's been some reaction from some of the Latin American countries that they're not sure that they share that view, some of the Europeans also have some significant trading relationships and interests, less than in other parts of the world, but there is some unease about that as well. But they also don't quite know what it means. So, I mean, is Spain supposed to stop investing in Peruvian industry? I suspect not. I don't think that's what the administration is asking for, and the Spanish don't seem to think so, and they're still doing it, and no one's complaining to them. But there is some unease about that, is what I'm feeling, what I'm observing. I don't have more to say right now because there hasn't been anything operational for the Europeans. Now, if actions happen related to Cuba, where there's a decent amount of European investment, this may become more practical and more real, and we may be talking about specific industries or investments or trading relationships or products or things like that. But right now, it's a little more philosophical. I saw another hand over here somewhere. Yes.
I was wondering, with your talk about predictability and the U.S. kind of being in a state of unpredictability, where do you
I didn't say that.
Sorry about that.
You may have inferred that from my remarks. But
Where do you think that the BRICS countries stand with this when it comes to trade?
they're watching. So, I mean, they have a very different agenda. And actually, every single member of the BRICS has a different agenda from all the other members of the BRICS. The one thing they can agree on is the current international system is not sufficiently satisfying their interests, and so they want to be organized to seek to achieve changes in the system that more closely align with their interests. But after that, even getting into what interests and how very, very different, most of the BRICS countries are interested in greater prosperity and greater opportunity in the international system. And they want to see barriers for their trade reduced, but they aren't necessarily opposed to barriers to other people's trade, particularly if it would benefit their trade. Does that make sense? But what they are looking for are conversations, and what they are looking for is to be heard. And I will just say at times that is very, very valid. And at times it also feels very much like almost performance art. So we do have to take seriously the feedback and the concerns we hear from the Global South, from the BRICS, from others. And there are ways the United States, I think, can be a leader in doing things, as I described with Europe, but with other regions of the world, with other countries of the world as well, in ways that are win-win. We do still have to be clear-eyed about our own interests as well, and they sometimes aren't going to be the same as some of the members of the BRICS. And you're seeing this right now. We're not going to be changing sanctions on, well, I don't know that. I would anticipate in the short term, the regime we have against Russia isn't going to be changing very much. We just announced enormous changes in the rather large sanctions the president had placed on India. Brazil, it's more personal than it is macro. So I don't quite know where that's going to go. My guess is it's going to get better rather than worse, because every time one of these leaders the president's deeply frustrated with comes and meets with him, as we saw with the president of Colombia the other day, things find a way of working themselves out. So Brazil's going to be interesting too. So it's just a, and then it's this, you know, I don't feel that we get a lot of operational unified positions out of the BRICS. I think we get a lot of unified complaints. That's different. So it's hard to respond to that. I saw you, and I'll go over there. Please.
Hello, my name is Lindsley.
And we have time for 2 more questions, I'm told. So it'll be you, and then we're going to be done. Go ahead, sorry.
Hello, my name is Noah Lindsley. Thank you for coming and giving this talk. I'm an international studies major. I was wondering if you had any advice for people interested in perhaps foreign service, diplomatic avenues of government, people who are interested in these parts of government, on how to sort of not get demoralized or discouraged by current changes in the administration. Because I think for a lot of people in my cohort who sort of grew up in a time of relative geopolitical stability, how they can sort of rise to the challenge and make positive change in a time where it seems that everything is sort of in flux.
Things are in flux, but I'll say, first of all, public service is a noble calling. And I was proud in my 34 and a half years to serve Republicans and Democrats alike. I think I had 6 presidents and about 8 or 9 secretaries of state. And one of the joys of being a foreign service officer, a career professional, is you take an oath, but it is to the Constitution of the United States. And so as long as that leader is constitutionally elected, it is your job to implement their policy. It's your job to give them your best possible advice, but they can choose to ignore it, and they certainly have, Republicans and Democrats alike as well. I would encourage anybody who feels that they want to engage in public service to not be discouraged. Every single day for 34 and a half years, I represented the United States of America. That was pretty amazing. It was an enormous opportunity. It was a privilege, and it was a pleasure. There were days I was more frustrated than others, but I believe strongly in this country. I'm proud to represent it, and I was proud to do so. And I accept that some people may have policy concerns with any given administration, and particularly this one in certain ways. I'm hearing subtext from your question. But there's still an awful lot of good you can do for the United States in public service, whether you agree with some of the president's policies or not. And one of the things I appreciated in my career is, this didn't happen to me so much, but I saw some colleagues go through it. You occasionally can be asked to do something you disagree with, fundamentally. And there's 2 categories of things. Things that you believe may not be legal, and things that you believe transcend or cross your moral lines, right? The first one is actually easier, the legality of the thing you're being asked to do or told to do. That's actually a pretty easy thing. What I mean by that is you don't have to decide if it's legal or not. You might know, you might have been trained, but there are lawyers in the Department of State and in every other federal agency whose job it is to determine whether things are legal or not. And you always have the right to say, this thing you just told me to do, I'm not sure it's legal, and I want to make sure it is. And so the lawyers will then assess it, and they'll give you an answer. And if they tell you it's legal, well, then you're done. Because I didn't hear you say you were studying law, and I didn't study law, so I had to trust the lawyers. And I did that once or twice in my career. Once I was right, once I was wrong. Fair enough. But that one can be resolved. And once the lawyers told me it wasn't illegal, then he or she, or in this case, it's always been he in my life, the President of the United States or the Secretary of State, there were some she's there, and they get to decide these things. They might be ignoring my advice. I also appreciate the opportunity to always give that advice, and we do have those mechanisms. You have to be careful when you choose to use them, but you can always say, this instruction you gave me, I'm not sure it's going to be successful. Here's how we might do it better, or you may want to amend what you want achieved. You got to be careful when you do that, but you, as a Foreign Service officer, you always have the right to do that, and that's pretty powerful. The second category is harder, that it's legal, but you think it's immoral, or it crosses your sense of virtue or values, and I do not mean to diminish that at all. And I had colleagues go through that at different times. I think I was lucky I never found myself in that circumstance exactly. I found some things that came close, but I could live with myself. I certainly was asked to implement policies that I thought were going to be unsuccessful, or were even, to use a technical diplomatic term, boneheaded. But that happens in every administration. But on the morality thing, then you have a question. You have to decide. And your options are to resign rather than do it. And I had some colleagues do that. But also the Department of State was generally pretty forgiving. And it wasn't always a career booster. But if you said, I can't do this thing, I don't want to be part of this policy, I accept that it's the president's or the secretary's or whoever's right to establish it, but I don't want to be part of it, it crosses my moral lines, I won't sleep well at night, I can't live with myself doing this. We found places for you. They weren't always the best places, but you could be transferred to a different job where you didn't have to confront that thing. That was my experience. As I said, it wasn't always beneficial for your career, but you were not fired, and you didn't have to do the thing you were objecting to morally. That was my experience. And I was grateful for it. I'll just say, I'm a big plug for public service. I spent 34 and a half years as a public servant, and every day was a privilege. And as I think you heard from the themes, this matters. Advancing the interests of the United States, protecting American interests, seeing things we want to see achieved to support our prosperity, our security, our sovereignty, it matters. And so we want good people coming from a good place. And I'm really interested, one of the reasons I'm here at the University of Idaho is the Foreign Service and some of these national security apparatus are still very East Coast heavy. I'm a boy from Bellingham, Washington. I never met anybody like me who'd served in the Foreign Service until I went to college. And someone showed up at my campus and talked about it, and I learned about this career path. And I want to do that for you if you didn't know. Because I want people from Washington and Oregon and Idaho and Utah and Montana and Wyoming and elsewhere in the public service as well. We are the United States of America. We're a great big broad place, but can we have a few less people from Yale and a few more people from, nothing against Yale, it's a great institution, but from other places as well, who bring the perspective of growing up in Moscow or Coeur d'Alene or Boise or Twin Falls or Bellingham or Mount Vernon or Yelm or whatever it is, right? Because we have a perspective too, and we are just as much a part of this big experiment. So I hope you're paying attention. All right, last question we've already gone over, but we're going to take a few more minutes.
My name's Aspen. I study marketing, but my minor's interactive political science and economics. I want to say thank you for your time, but also for your answer to that last question. I wanted to ask, when you examine the conflict between Russia and Ukraine and how these conflicts affect, in your terminology, neighboring countries or in the neighborhood that it's around, how drastic would these effects have to become to justify a more strong United States presence in those neighboring countries?
Yeah, I mean, we have a pretty strong presence in the NATO countries right on the periphery. But President, when it was looking fairly clear that Russia was going to invade Ukraine, the Ukrainians very much wanted U.S. forces in Ukraine. Again, it's a tripwire. And President Biden decided not to do that. And I don't fault him for that decision, because that would have meant a U.S.-Russia war with all the implications and consequences of that. So he tried to walk this fine line, which is very, very difficult, of supporting Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, of denying Russia the ability to establish a long-term change in borders through use of force, violating the post-war kind of norms, but not putting the United States in direct conflict with Russia. A country with, turns out, has nuclear weapons too. I think that was right. It's very, very hard, and it's dissatisfying to all concerned, but it's probably the least worst option from my perspective. And this is the issue of Ukrainian NATO membership for a lot of Europeans as well, because once they join the alliance, if they join the alliance, we no longer get to ask ourselves, should we defend Ukraine directly by sending our forces there, rather than sending training and materiel, which we did in millions and millions and millions of dollars worth of materiel and training in support of the Ukrainians. But if and when they become NATO members, that calculation changes. And so I suspect you will not find consensus in the alliance for Ukrainian membership in NATO until a couple things happen. And one is that there's no longer a direct Russian threat, because otherwise you're signing up for a war with Russia. The other one is the Ukraine still is not done with its reforms. The Ukrainians like to kind of shoot past this one, but NATO membership is not easy. Qualifying for NATO membership is not easy. Meeting the alliance standards, there's the military standard, which the Ukrainians probably are pretty close to at this point, of the military capabilities, but there are also values-based pieces, and some of them is having agencies of government that have integrity, having good national security decision-making processes. And one of the other challenges we are facing with Ukraine, and that we're open about it, is there's still a decent amount of mismanagement and corruption within the government services that would disqualify any NATO aspirant at this time. It doesn't mean it can't be fixed, because it can be, and a lot of other governments have. But that's an area where Ukraine has actually not given enough attention to, because they've been legitimately busy fighting a war with Russia. But to become a NATO member, they're going to have to do that. So I think I'll stop there. This has been a pleasure. I hope this was useful for you. It was a lot of fun for me. Thank you very much.